before, warning that Kennedy was going to be killed in Dallas, and it never went anywhere, did not come to Dallas. I think this shows that there was collusion at the very top of the government. But this was clear destruction of evidence. Intimidations and suppression of evidence, intimidation of witnesses. Phil Willis, I loved him. He was the first, and Major Phil Willis, he was the first American to capture a Japanese in World War II. He was stationed in Hawaii, and there was a little Japanese two-man sub that they fired on, and it was sinking, so the two crew members climbed out and were swimming ashore. One of them didn't make it. The other one crawled up on the beach, and it was Phil Willis who went over and took him into captivity, becoming the first American to capture a Japanese prisoner. A really fine gentleman. He says, I'd tell the Warren Commission yes, and they'd put down no. And his daughter, Linda Willis, says the same thing. They were just, Lee Bowers, I was there to tell them only what they asked, and when they wanted to cut off the conversation, I figured that was the end of it. Because he was in the railroad tower looking behind the picket fence on the grassy knoll. And he said he saw two men back behind the fence at the time of the shooting, and although the road goes down below ground level, so he couldn't see what was happening on Elm Street, but he could see what was happening behind the fence. And he said something caught his eye. Okay, whoa, okay, wait a minute, what's the next question? What was it? Now, Warren Commission attorney said, so were there a lot of policemen up there later on? Well, yeah, they all came running up there, and he totally leads them off in another direction. But in 1966, when Mark Lane came in and did taped interviews, Lee Bowers was one of them, and they finally asked him a question, well, what is it that caught your attention? He said it was a puff of smoke or a flash, okay, from behind the picket fence. Now, that's just intimidation of witnesses, and Sam Hollins tried to tell them that there was a shot from behind the picket fence, and he said, well, the commission, I think, had to report in the book what they wanted the world to believe. They had to prove Oswald did it. And of course, Jean Hill, who was a wonderful lady, they took her, and she had friends in the Dallas Police Department. They subpoenaed her and wanted her, or wrote her a letter and wanted her to come to Washington to testify the Warren Commission. And her friends in the Dallas Police Department said, don't go. Said, you might not come back. Because they realized how heavy this whole thing was and what was going on. So she didn't go. So the next thing you know, Arlen Specter got her, took her to Parkland Hospital, put her in a little room with no window, and began to browbeat her. And she kept saying, well, look, do you want to hear what I'm wanting to tell you? Are you telling me what you want me to say to you? And he says, he finally told me, look, we can make you look as crazy as Marguerite Oswald, and everybody knows how crazy she is. We could have put you in a mental institution if you don't cooperate with us. That's intimidation of witnesses. These people over here all claim that their testimony was altered. Testimony altered by the FBI. These witnesses, we won't even go down through them all, but man, these are some of the most important witnesses of them all. Siebert and O'Neill, the two FBI agents who were present at the autopsy, and were there making notes about everything that happened at the autopsy, and they talked about surgery to the top of the head, and there was no surgery to the top of the head at Parkland. And everybody talks about the gaping wound in the back of the head, but the one that really fascinates me is the hole in the throat. When Kennedy was brought into Parkland Hospital, he had a 1/4 of an inch puncture wound near his Adam's apple in the throat at the front. And all the doctors who saw it said it was a puncture wound, and therefore it was an entrance wound. Well, of course, Oswald is hiding behind him. He's not in front of him. So they had a problem there. But then, when trying to save the president's life, they weren't interested in examining the wounds. They were trying to save the president's life. So they made a 1/2 inch incision with a scalpel or a very sharp instrument right through that 1/4 inch hole to facilitate a tracheotomy tube that they put in there. Now, when you took the tube out, the skin closed back together, kind of like a paper cut. Hurts like mad when you press your skin together. You can't even tell there's a cut there. When they pressed it back together, then just a little hole was there. In fact, in the medical reports, they said the wound was inviolate. which means it had not been violated. It just put a little incision through there, half-inch incision. And yet, when that body arrived for autopsy, this little quarter-inch hole with a half-inch slit through it had been enlarged to a 3-inch wide gaping gash. So wide, so gaping that the autopsy doctors did not even know it was a bullet wound. They were told that they had tried the tracheotomy, so they assumed they just ravaged his throat to try to put this tracheotomy tube in there, and they'd body off for burial when Humes happened to call down to Dallas and found out that there was a bullet hole in his throat. So he burned his autopsy notes, the original one, went back, rewrote the whole thing, trying to account for this other shot. What lousy investigation. I mean, I'm telling you, there are winos who die in major American cities today who get better autopsies than the President of the United States. Richard Randolph Carr, Dickie Carr, he's a steel worker. He reported seeing 2 men run from behind the school book depository and drive off in a Rambler station wagon. And the police tried to the FBI tried to coerce him into saying he didn't see that, or it was Oswald. And so what happened to Dickie Worrell? Well, according to a friend of his that I spoke to, they found Worrell on the outskirts of Dallas along with his girlfriend, both lying in the roadway or on the shoulder with his motorcycle on the kickstand, and both of them had a broken neck, and they ruled it a motorcycle accident. In other words, he and his girlfriend riding along, and they tump their motorcycle, and it breaks their necks, but he gets up and puts the motorcycle back up on the kickstand and then lays down and dies. Come on. And that just goes on and on. You know, if you read my book, you'll read about all the dead witnesses. So you can... Now, this brings us to even the weirdest issue of all, which is questions over Oswald's identity. Now, if that sounds weird, just consider this message. This is June the 3rd, 1960. This is 3 years before the assassination. And J. Edgar Hoover himself sends this memo to the security office of the State Department. And he says, since there's a possibility that an imposter is using Oswald's birth certificate, any current information the Department of State may have concerning this subject will be appreciated. Now, y'all think about that. Some of you who are my age, and you were there at the time, you'll recall that we were told that nobody in government knew anything about Oswald. He just kind of fell between the cracks. J. Edgar Hoover personally was aware of Lee Harvey Oswald 3 years before the assassination, and was warning that someone was impersonating him. So then we get this picture taken about the time of his defection to Russia, and that's another thing. He didn't actually defect. He never defected. In fact, he got to Russia, we don't know how, because there were no commercial flights or buses or anything that could account for the time frame between the time that he got to Helsinki and the time he got into Moscow. We don't know how he got in there. Probably from some help from the CIA. But now, let's look at this picture, and we'll look at it a little bit closer. Number one, you can see obvious retouching on his eyebrow and on his mouth. Plus, you can see that all the light source is coming from his left, and because the right is all in deep shadow, and yet, look, his shadow's over here to the left. So something really screwy about this picture. And then you can see that there's a little break in his hairline here, and there's a break in his chin, his mouth. So if you draw a line from here to here and separate them, you got two separate people. They look similar, but they're not the same. This is Lee, this is Harvey. And that's not the only ones. And by the way, this is a very typical intelligence technique. If you got somebody that looks pretty much like somebody else and you're trying to get them into another country or whatever, then you take half this face and you Photoshop it in with half the other face, and then you put that on their passport, and when somebody looks at it and says, yeah, they look pretty much the same, so it'll pass through any kind of security. And now you can notice, we just looked at this one, but now here you can see the same thing here. You match everything up, and yet here's Lee, here's Harvey. Here's the Marine Oswald, here's Harvey. When you line everything up, they look pretty much the same, except, oops, the Marine is a few inches taller than Harvey. And this is reflected in the records. His Marine record shows he was 5'11", and yet when he was autopsied in Dallas, he was 5'9". I thought the Marine Corps built men, not tear them down a few inches. So see, this gets stranger and stranger. Even his own mother asked to have the body exhumed back in 1967, questioning scars and birthmarks and things on the body. Paul Grudy again told me that about a week after they buried Oswald, the Secret Service showed up at the Miller Funeral Home and questioned him about marks on the body, scars, whatever. And he said one of them finally commented, said, "We don't know who's buried in that grave." So see, not only did he not do the shooting, he might not even been the real Lee Harvey Oswald. And we just saw the warning by Hoover 3 years before. So we could go on and on, there's so much, but there. Now we've seen the evidence of suppression of evidence, fabrication of evidence, alteration of evidence, destruction of evidence, intimidation of witnesses. These are criminal acts in connection with a capital murder case. In fact, what's really interesting is that his body was taken illegally from Dallas. Federal agents pulled guns, they were cursing, they almost had a fist fight with the Dallas coroner who said under the law you can't move the body until there's been an inquest. And they said, "This is the President of the United States." Got away, pulled guns on him, and they whisked him on out. And they said this was on orders of Lyndon Johnson, who said, "We need to get the body back to Washington." So in other words, Lyndon Johnson, upon becoming President of the United States, one of his first acts was to violate the laws of his own state. So who was responsible for these criminal acts? Lyndon Johnson. He personally ordered the limousine destroyed, destruction of evidence, violated the laws of his own state, had his assistant Cliff Carter go to Henry Gonzalez and pick up the clothing of Governor Connolly, and then when it was finally presented as evidence to the Warren Commission, it had been cleaned and pressed, destroying all forensic evidence. And who was actually in charge of the investigation? J. Edgar Hoover, Johnson's old buddy and next door neighbor. Who profited, which individuals profited most from the assassination? These two fellows. Richard Nixon was in Dallas that week. In fact, he flew out that morning, about an hour or so before the assassination. Because of the time difference, it had already occurred by the time he landed in New York, and according to his biography, he was in a taxi cab in New York when he first heard that the president had been shot. About 2 weeks later, in early December, the FBI went to question Richard Nixon and asked him, "When were you in Dallas the last time?" He said, "I don't really remember. I think it was in the spring, back in the spring of '63. He's in Dallas. I thought everybody in the world knew where they were when Kennedy was shot. But Richard Nixon didn't know. George Herbert Walker Bush didn't seem to know either." Okay, so Richard Nixon, while he was in Dallas, predicted that Johnson was going to be dropped from the Democratic ticket in 1964. There had been nothing but bad blood between him and the Kennedys. And he was chafing, and they called him Uncle Cornpone, and they sent him off on junkets just to get him out of the White House. And so he's about to lose his job. And not only that, worse than that, he's about to go to prison because of his involvement in the Bobby Baker scandal, the TFX scandal, the Billy Saul Estes scandal. And yet, when the assassination took place, he became president. All of those went away, just went away. Hoover. It was already well known and rumored in Washington that the Kennedys were going to retire Hoover because he was at the mandatory retirement age. And they didn't even have to come up with an excuse. They say, "Sorry, you hit the federal mandatory retirement age, you're out." And yet, 1 month After the assassination in January '64, Johnson holds a press conference in the Rose Garden of the White House, praises J. Edgar Hoover for his fight against communism, never mind that he had consistently denied there was anything like the mafia or organized crime. But he fought against communism and exempted him from the mandatory retirement age, thereby installing Hoover as FBI director for life. So these two guys who were in total control of the investigation into Kennedy. But I want to tell you that I, for one, do not believe that either one of those guys, they were powerful, they were mean. Johnson